I would like to welcome everybody for today's first breakout session of DASICON 2022. My name is Marta Wawrzyniak. I'm a student of 14th ETIA program at the Diplomatische Akademie of Vienna, and I will moderate today's session. The topic of today's session is food security and international relations, as the production, distribution, and consumption of food stopped to be purely economical issue and started to enter political debate more and more. And we will look on that issue closely today. It's an honor and pleasure for me to introduce the speakers of today's breakout session. Our first speaker, Ms. Maja Bučar, is a professor of development studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ljubljana. And our second speaker, Ms. Polina Tonkikh, is the Director General of the WTO Expertise Center. It's an honor and pleasure for all of us to have you here. I would also like to ask participants to stay muted throughout the session. And I would also like to remind everybody that it's possible to post questions anytime during the duration of the session. However, we are asking to post these questions to the questions account directly via chat. I will also quickly introduce the structure of today's session. We will start with the presentations from both speakers, and then I will open the floor for the questions. Without further introduction, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Ms. Maja Bučar.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody from Ljubljana. I was hoping that this time the conference will be live after such a long period of not being able to meet people in person, but alas, we have to resort to the virtual conference participation as well. Let me briefly state what I consider the main issues in this area of discussion of food security and international relations. I have to tell you that this is really much more, I would say, political economy than just purely political issue, because it does start with the issue of how to provide sufficient amount of food, because if we just start with the definition of what food security means and then go on, we talk about the fact that what we need to provide is for all the people to have it all the time, both physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. That's the kind of definition we start with. Now, this is a very difficult task. You may have heard already in the previous session about the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 2, which brings the issue of food security to the international fora. It's only one of the most recent goals that the international community has set for itself in the area of food security. And even though the target is globally agreed, I think we could find a lot of problems with its implementation, particularly once we move into the area of food production, food distribution, access to land. All of these issues come very much in the public attention. But if I stick to the international relations, probably one of the biggest concerns here is the question whether the current agricultural policies are driven towards providing food security or not. One of the long-term issues, and I think my colleague Polina will be able to shed even more light to this, is a question of how important is trade for developing countries. The theory itself actually suggests that one of the first moves that the countries can make through their export orientation is to export primary goods meaning also export of food items, or if not food items, agricultural products. Now, the question here, of course, is if we go into this type of export orientation strategy, what does that mean for the local production of food? Not only is one of the reasons how this food is being is one of the issues how this food is being produced, usually on the best lands available by large corporations, which pushes the small farmers to the smaller plots, less productive land, and very often the food production stays at a very low technological level and is primarily a place where women work. What this causes then, of course, is severe problems in many countries in terms of food security, because the agricultural commodities which are aimed at exports are not necessarily food items. Usually, as you see, more of the products which the developed countries need, including the most, I would say one of such examples would be the flour exports. Now, the issue of these two types of production, on one hand, this modern production, which is aiming at exports, and the other, the sustainable agriculture oriented for local food production, opens all sorts of issues, including one of them, which I think is attracting insufficient attention, and that's the question of the use of water in developing countries in agriculture production. Where does the water go? Who has the rights to water? Who has the rights to land? We have come across now a term which is called land grabbing, where countries or corporations from developed countries actually lease land in developing countries for their own needs, for their own production. Again, many cases show that this has been done in a semi-legal fashion of, bribing the local government to hand over the land which traditionally belonged to village communities, causing all sorts of social and economic problems, and of course limiting again the access to food, limiting again the food security. So food issues, I think, are going to be, if they are already, but they're going to be even more a top political issue in global world. Of course, closely tied to what I was talking about are the other side of the trade issues, which I expect my colleague will focus more on. And it's a question of all the way the global trade in agricultural commodities is being handled. And with this, I would just pass my word on to her so that I don't take too much of your time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maja, for this amazing remarks, very insightful remarks. I will indeed now pass the floor to Ms. Polina Tonkikh for her presentation.
Thanks a lot, and many thanks to the organizers and especially the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna for this conference. I'm pleased to be one of the conference speakers and participants. It was interesting to hear some of the insights coming from the distinguished representatives of the Austrian government, as well as the expert community. And we will obviously hear more ideas on the future of food in the coming sessions. So given my background in international trade negotiations, international trade law, and the World Trade Organization, where when posted in Geneva, I was particularly responsible for trade negotiations and agriculture, in my intervention today, I would like to take a look at food security in the context of international trade relations, just like my distinguished colleague, Dr. Maja Bučar has mentioned. So I'll focus on that. So in my presentation today, I will focus on 4 ways to address food security concerns in this regard. First, integration and inclusiveness. Second, building food stocks. Third, minimizing barriers to trade flows. And fourth, achieving self-sufficiency targets. First off, I would start by underlining that from what we have studied at our center, clear, transparent, and predictable international trade rules could certainly help in ensuring food security. Generally, international trade plays an important role in food security issues because in today's world, the majority of goods, including agricultural products, aren't produced in just one country or region. On the contrary, the production chain may include several dozens of countries. So this brings me to my first point on addressing food security. It could be done through participation and active integration into the global value chains, or GVCs, which are expanding even in the times of the pandemic. It is often done through multinational enterprises that do grow, produce, and market their product in many different countries. To name a few MNEs here, I should say Nestle, Heinz, Kohler, Mars, Danone, and so on and so forth. We all know them. However, what is important is to also include SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, how they could participate in GVCs. And here we also see that there are some proposals on the WTO agenda, for example. Now, second, building food stocks. One of the trade policy, this is also another way to address food security. So one of the trade policy instruments that is being negotiated at the WTO, you may have heard, is public stockholding for food security purposes. The idea behind it is that the developing countries get the opportunity to produce stocks at administered prices. Well, now under the existing WTO rules, procurement at administered prices is called market price support and is classified as trade distorting support, which should be limited. However, with reference to food security issues, some of the developing countries would like to procure stocks without a limit, so as to assure their food security. However, there are adverse effects that may take place in case large volumes of products are released from stocks overnight and exported, for example, and this may influence international prices and lead to displacements of other countries from certain markets. So to sum up on this, building internal reserves or stocks is yet another way of ensuring food security, but such instruments need to be carefully drafted so as to eliminate or minimize any adverse effects caused by its implementation of this mechanism. Third, barriers to trade flows. Now on that, an example here would be export restrictions. They may be temporarily applied by countries to prevent or relieve critical shortages of foodstuffs. This is allowed by the WTO rules. What is important here that in accordance with the rules of the WTO and the Agreement on Agriculture, for example, the WTO member instituting the export prohibition or restriction shall give due consideration to the effects of such restriction on importing members' food security. So that's where the issue of food security comes into play. On the other hand, some members have also highlighted that for an exporting member that actually institutes this export restriction, the issue of food security may be of equivalent or sometimes even higher importance as for the importing country as well as for the importing country. Especially when it concerns something like grains or wheat in particular, which is required for the production of bread. So this issue has come up quite a few times at the WTO now, with a number of proposals on improving trade rules in this regard. And I'm a strong advocate, obviously, for the WTO rules-based system. And I also think that the United Nations World Food Programme and UN FAO can play an important role in ensuring food security here. Finally, self-sufficiency. Many countries, when addressing food security, focus on achieving self-sufficiency targets on particular products. The food security strategic documents adopted by countries may indicate certain self-sufficiency targets for product groups, such as 85% for meat and fish products, or like 60% for fruits and berries. In terms of international trade relations, such policies usually affect market access. But self-sufficiency targets cannot be, to my opinion, cannot be just one way of addressing the issue of food security. It has to be coupled with something. And so to sum up here, I would say that coupled with some other measures, such as integration into global value chains, for example, then of course self-sufficiency targets can constitute an effective strategy on ensuring food security. Last but not least, on the green agenda aspect, a couple of words. I would agree with some previous speakers talking about the importance on the climate change and the Green Deal, and also echoing on what Austrian Federal Minister for Agriculture, Regions and Tourism, Ms. Elisabeth Köstinger, has mentioned. when lots of efforts are put into the realization of the Green Deal in the EU, while at the same time trade agreements with third countries are being concluded by the EU, and as a result, less green, in a way, products are being imported into the European market, that might raise certain issues. And this also raises questions on subsidies in agriculture, because subsidies that will be needed to achieve climate neutrality, including in agriculture, might be quite large. And as we know, subsidies are regulated by the WTO rules as well. So all in all, that raises important questions on what multilateral rules on achieving climate neutrality should be, including in agriculture, so as to achieve goals on food security as well. With that, I would like to conclude my intervention. I would welcome any of your questions and would be glad to participate in a fruitful discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for your remarks, for your presentation. I would like to open now the floor for questions and remind all the participants that it's possible still to post questions directly to the questions account via chat. The first question is coming from Katarina Furkrantz, and she would like to ask this question individually. So Katarina, you can unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you very much for your insights. My question is probably best directed at Dr. Bučar, because I was wondering if the systematic issues that prevent the Global South from being self-sufficient in terms of food security are going to be removed anytime soon, or do you think that we are somewhat stuck and that we would need to revise the system first? Thank you.
Should I answer right away, or would you like to collect more questions? What is the moderator, the rule of the game?
We are answering the questions once it's posted.
Right away.
Yeah,
okay.
Right away.
Okay. Well, Katerina, I was recently at a session when somebody says this is a $1 million question and yours is about the same. I think the entire global agriculture markets are very complicated, and they definitely have a very strong influence on the position of developing countries. The self-sufficiency there is, I think, even less possible to be achieved than it is in developed world. Developed world has access to lots of means. Because it's not just the land that you need. You also need the tools, you also need fertilizers, and you need to look into who controls the trade in various agricultural inputs. And one of the things which concerns me probably even more than the question of export restrictions in terms of food items is different non-trade barriers that Polina didn't touch upon. But in the agricultural sector, we can see them on a daily basis, what different countries in the name of, I don't know, protection of environment, protection of the market, whatnot, introduce. And of course, I would say we developed countries, particularly, EU and also US, Australia, are quite skillful in designing something which is difficult to catch. We have WTO rules. Which tell you what you could do, what you should be doing. But beyond that, you can be quite inventive, and the countries seem to be inventive. I still remember a WTO case of Mexico and US, where US was stopping the import of lettuce. Lettuce is quite a perishable good. If you don't export my salad today, then tomorrow it's gone. And what US claimed was that a particular parcel, a particular set of export quantity was being sprayed by a certain type of insecticide, which was forbidden in US. And therefore the entire crop or the entire plant quantity of lettuce to go to American market was banned from entering US. After months of pushing back and forth, it was discovered that this kind of chemical also does not exist in Mexico. But for the lettuce producers, well, this was long gone story. I mean, they lost their money, they lost their produce. So, I think the problem today is that there's something you can negotiate about, but there's lots of things which are sort of hidden in behind that it's so difficult to come up with. And I think probably Polina can confirm this. It's also a question of negotiating skills, of knowing where where the tricks lie for developing countries to push forward their ideas and to make WTO rules more favorable to them as well.
Thank you so much. Ms. Tonkikh, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you very much. Would just indeed would agree with my distinguished colleague on that. And on a number of occasions, various non-tariff measures, including SPS or TBT, or especially SPS, are applied in a manner that would constitute indeed a trade barrier rather than a trade measure in the sense of protecting the animal welfare or the health of people as prescribed in Article 20 of the GATT. So that also poses serious threats to food security, indeed. And however, with SPS especially, I consider that obviously when the government of any country, including the US or the EU or any other country, is instituting this measure, they do consider the interests of their inside stakeholders. I hope they, I hope we all do. Well, they try to consider the interests, hopefully not all only of those producing similar goods. So in that case, that's pure protectionism, basically. But I sincerely hope that they take into account the interests of the people as well, because they are the ones who are consuming these goods that are being imported. And of course, obviously, if they are restricted by SPS measures, that poses serious threats on their livelihood, basically. So that's, with that, I would like to conclude this point. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Katerina, for your question. We have another question coming from Gabriele Melindo, who also wants to answer a question individually. So Gabriele, you can unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta, and a big thank you to our speakers for their insightful contribution. My question regards the role of international organizations in food security, because worldwide there are several international institutions dealing with this topic, including, for instance, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Programme, the World Bank, and of course, the World Trade Organization. And given this abundance of institutions, I was interested in knowing whether there is a serious risk of interinstitutional rivalry that could be problematic in achieving global food security. For instance, if there is a lack of coordination or overlapping mandates. So is this high number of institutions to which one has to add also states and NGOs and other IR actors a problem or a resource for the global food security goals? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriele. Maja, Ms. Tonkikh, who would like to ask, who would like to answer first?
Maybe this time Ms. Tonkikh should go first, since she's from the international organization.
Let's try. Let's do that. Thank you very much, Gabrielle, for this question. Very interesting one indeed. Well, I should say that on many occasions, this would probably be the case, like where we need to look at overlapping mandates of various international organizations, not always rivalry, but sometimes just technical issues. One of the interesting things that comes up into my mind in this regard is our negotiations on fisheries subsidies, for example, because as we know, the SDG 14.6, as far as I remember, is on fisheries. And it is obviously the UN goal. And it is being realized, tries to be realized through one of the agreements in the WTO. So the negotiations are ongoing on the Fisheries Subsidies agreement. The problem arises that we do not have universal organizations that would deal with fisheries management. So we only have fragmented regional fisheries management organizations that do not cover the whole globe. And for that reason, it makes it for the WTO very difficult to actually negotiate on something that is not being multilateralized elsewhere. So yes, on subsidies, the WTO would be the primary organization, but the problem arises with the technical details, like how do we see vessels coming into various ports. This issue has to be handled elsewhere, and we do not have do not always have proper regulation in place. So this is one point where I indeed see the problem, and this is not about probably the rivalry, but the lack of coordination sometimes at the global level. Then, however, on food security, I would say that from what I have seen and what I have experienced at the WTO, the mandate is more or less clear. I mean, whatever is referred to in the WTO agreement on agriculture first, other, of course, agreements such as the GATT. The negotiating mandate is clear with the decision that I have mentioned, but of course on food security the WTO is not the primary organization, and indeed United Nations with all of its various agencies would have more of a say on that. And I think over there, especially FAO or United Nations World Food Programme, they indeed are the primary primary rule setters, so to say, in terms of food security, and only trade elements are being resolved at the WTO. And therefore, in this regard, at least on that issue, I don't see that much of an overlapping or a conflict. But other spheres, indeed, that might be the case. That's from what I have seen. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if my colleague would like to maybe add a different point of view on that.
Thank you so much for your remarks. Maja, do you want to answer as well?
Well, basically, if you look at the origins of the mandate, each of these organizations has a very clearly cut out tasks, what they should be doing. Now, the question, of course, may arise in details once you are operating in the field, whether there is enough coordination or not. One of the areas that I can ally to or think about it is the question of, let's say, development assistance. And there you can see sometimes a bit of an overlap, particularly in terms of one project being ended by one organization and the next organization already coming in with similar ideas. And of course, that's part of the issue also of, the relationship between the receiving country and the organizations which are providing assistance, be it individual states or be it international organizations. It's a tough question. I think there's plenty of room for everyone, and enough of a mandate for each of these organizations to find their room. If I think of FAO, I would think primarily of some organization which will help me organize my agriculture production, which will organize support, teaching, support, this kind of assistance. On the other hand, the World Food Organization is stepping in where we have food scarcity. So, both have a very specific role to play, and WTO, of course, monitoring how the trade in agriculture goes. Now, in the terrain, of course, the overlaps may happen, but this is a question, I would say, of a will to cooperate. And I think with lack of resources, at least my view is that there's more cooperation than there used to be, because nobody has enough to carry out all the activities on their own. You know, if you look at many of the documentations, we keep on calling for pooling of the resources together, of co-financing, of, you know, all of these big words which are happening. And I think there is a move in this direction, also in terms of, you know, in getting involved the private sector to step in and also assist in providing the funds. So I think maybe the funding issue is something which is helping in the area of coordination as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Gabriele, for your question. The next question is coming from Lea Samonik, who asked me to post a question for her. So it seems to me that food security is rather a technical concept than the one focusing in particular on the access to enough food. Are there any attempts to include a more value-driven approach to food in international relations that can account, for example, for the right to culturally appropriate and healthy food? And the question is directed to both speakers. So whoever wants to take the floor first.
Thank you for passing this hot potato to me. Well, I wouldn't say that food security is a technical issue. I think the food security is very much a political issue. And with that, of course, comes also the issues that you are mentioning in your question. And we can, you know, look at the levels at which we discuss this. If we discuss that at the level of a national state, there, of course, is the issue of distribution, of the functioning of the markets, of the local markets, the distribution of income. All of these issues come into the foreground. If we take this on the international level, again, you know, we have the questions resulting from: is the trade fair? Is the quality control in trade of agriculture products really aimed at protecting consumer, or is it more there to prevent the competition, or to sort of skew the competition? And this then results in, you know, the values that you were mentioning in the type of, you know, quality, appropriateness, all of these things, you know. And so it's really far from being just a technical issue. Every technicality has behind it some economic, some political issue as well. So you have to be very careful to really distill the problem down to its very essence and see what's behind it. You know, sometimes at the first glance you say, well, this is good. But then when you look a little bit further, you see that it's really, it's hurting somebody somewhere along the line, even if on the surface it looks like how nice it is. You know, it's just think of the EU restrictions in terms of, you know, the shape of cucumber or the shape of banana and this kind of things that we have invented in our trade. I, as a consumer, really don't mind if my banana is a couple of centimeters shorter or longer. And it's not there, and this regulation is definitely not there to protect me. Huh? So I pass now the words to.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I think the second part of the question was on culturally appropriate, if I heard it correctly, right? And I would probably think of maybe also drawing the line in between two notions of food security and food safety. So from what I've heard in that question, there were issues related more rather to food safety than food security. Sometimes they're overlapping, both of those issues, like when we're talking again, like for example, about SPS measures. On the one hand, we're ensuring that the food is safe for our consumption. So it's a food safety issue. On the other hand, it can become a trade policy measure, like a trade policy barrier that is used to ensure long-term food security goals. For example, when you protect the market, in fact, rather than just you know, facilitate trade, you try to protect your producers and eventually ensure that more of that product is produced inside the country, and that in that regard, this becomes a food security issue. Interesting on the cultural aspect, I think that so far we don't have that much on that of a discussion on that in terms of international trade negotiations. The issue has come up here and there in some of the disputes at the WTO, but not necessarily as a separate negotiating track or anything. But I think maybe in the current world, it would be an interesting sphere to explore, although very niche one, but at the same time a very interesting one. Culturally acceptable, what I'm thinking about also, you can view the European market in that regard with that case EC hormones, on the hormones in beef. So when basically the European Union was against using hormones in beef coming from the United States, and that was the case, the dispute considered at the WTO. So that can be viewed as one of the cultural aspects, I should say, and also one of the safety aspects you may consider, because that might not be very healthy to consume lots of hormones with your beef, but also it's also a cultural aspect of how the public in the European Union treats and considers agricultural products, and what kind of products it wants to see in its market. So with that, I would probably conclude my answers with this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for your answers. Thank you, Leah, for your question. We have one last question coming from Ksenia Stumkina, who would like to ask this question individually as well. So Ksenia, you can unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Marta. I have a question to Ms. Polina Tonkikh, that within the 4 ways of achieving food security, you have mentioned as the second step, the building of food stock and ability of the third countries that they have a right to organize such a stock. And my question is, are there any downsides of such policies, for instance, such as a possible overproduction by a country, or any miscalculations in with the level of the essential food support? And if there are so, what are the mechanisms of the WTO to regulate this policy of the public stocks? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Ksenia, for the question. From what I heard in your question, I think I need to clarify first that the mechanism that I've been talking about is the one that is mostly under the negotiation. There is an interim solution on it in place, but there is no permanent solution, and it is harshly debated at the WTO, also involving some political issues. I mean, in trade, in terms of international trade politics. So what we have to say here first, it's a mechanism for developing countries. So they're insisting on viewing it as a mechanism of trade and development agenda. So a mechanism of helping them to achieve, of other countries, like the developed members, helping them to achieve their food security purposes. And they feel in a way that they are entitled to that, because under the WTO, as you know, there is such a notion as special and differential treatment, so meaning the treatment for the developing world. However, as you know, with the rise of many economies such as China or India, this concept again a bit fades away, because not all developed members feel that they have to provide preferential treatment to the developing countries. At least limitless provide this kind of treatment. So now coming back, that was for the clarification of what this mechanism is about. And coming to your question on the downsides, Yes, you're right. Just like I've mentioned, like the stocks can be exported overnight and ruining the prices in international markets. So this is, for example, what the developed members are also afraid of. Not necessarily the developed, but also other developing countries that compete in the same market. So not all of them create stocks, right? And not all of them can export simultaneously. So for example, if I'm just mentioning one example, this can be India, this can be any other country, but for example, if the stock comes from India, it can influence international markets in a bad way, in an adverse way, as we mentioned at the WTO. And therefore, the mechanisms to combat this influence have been invented or thought of. One is transparency, obviously. So making sure that we know how much of stock is in each and every developing country is procured. How much of stock can be released from it and for which purposes. Second mechanism is kind of a safeguard mechanism. So in case you see exports coming, growing rapidly from one country, you can use some kind of a safeguard measure from a different country. But all of these mechanisms are obviously not in line with what the developing countries procuring these stocks want to see. So they would obviously be against such measures put in place. They have their point on one hand, because indeed on one hand it's an issue of food security, and sometimes they need to feed their people, sometimes even the farmers themselves. And they do use it for the internal market. But where is the line in between using it for the internal market and the experts and their experts? That's a very vague kind of a gray area or a vague subject, because because it's all in all, it's just one stock. And after all, you can't really distinguish what has been used for the internal one and what can be exported. So therefore, lots of mechanisms have been thought of. And so far, no decision on that because of this also no decision has been found. So you as future, I mean, all of the students of the Diplomatic Academy and the others can maybe find a solution to this problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ksenia, for your question. With these remarks, I would like to wrap up this breakout session.
May I only just add one
yes, of course. I'm so sorry.
I was saying it's interesting that this debate was started so actively after India started to build the stockpile of food items. It was not started when the EU dumped excess of dairy products to developing countries' markets. At that point, that was not considered as a trade violation. Just to shed a little bit of light on how political the decisions are.
Thank you so much for this remark. Well, currently, I think I can wrap up. We kind of need to wrap up the session right now. I would like to thank both of our speakers, Ms. Maja Bučar and Ms. Polina Tonkikh, for your interventions, for your remarks. I would also like to thank for all the questions, as well as to all the participants for joining this breakout session. We are currently moving to the lunch break, and we'll reassume the DASICON from 1:30 on. And I wish you a lovely break and see you on the next breakout sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta, for your amazing moderation of this session.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to my colleagues.